Sounds good. You guys can see me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, A How-To Guide to Improving Parent-Provider Communication with Justyn Balzar from the Hangout Spot. Today, Justyna will discuss how to communicate with your child's providers effectively so that everyone can support your child in the best way possible. Justyna is a Board Certified Behavior Analyst with a master's degree in education and co-founder of the Hangout Spot. She has over 15 years of experience with many different types of learners between the ages of 3 and 18. For more information on Justyna and the Hangout Spot, you can visit our website at www.spednetwilton.org or our Facebook page. All the information from today's webinar, including Justyna's PowerPoint, will be uploaded to the SpedNet Wilton website and Facebook page. Today, our moderators are Eve Kessler, founder of SpedNet Wilton, and co-president of SpedNet Wilton, Carolina Corrigan, and I am Janine Kelly. So any information provided in this webinar by Justyna or the moderators is not intended to be legal or therapeutic advice. The information, content, and materials are for general purposes only. And for those of you who are viewing offline after we have already posted this, if you have any questions, please email us at our email address. And then again, for more information, www.spednetwilton.org, Facebook, and Twitter at spednet_net. I will pass the baton on now to Justyna. Welcome, Justyna.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me back. It's always a lot of fun to come and speak to your community on this amazing platform that you ladies have created. So today we are going to be talking about communication, and communication is something that I am always striving to work on within my own life. I think as much as we are lifelong learners, we are always working on improving our communication skills because they don't always look the same with different people and communities that we communicate with. But what I hope that I will be able to provide you with today is some general strategies and ways of thinking about communication that will help to improve your relationships, your collaborative relationships with your providers and teams. So why don't we dive in? And just really quickly, for those of you who are aware of the Hangout Spot or are hearing about it for the first time, we are Connecticut's first center using the fundamentals of science to teach social smarts. So at the Hangout Spot, we believe that all children have a right to meaningful reciprocal relationships with others. And because of that, we strive very hard to eliminate barriers to friendship and to help children foster really problem-solving skills that they are able to take from the location that they're learning them in and apply them to areas where it really matters, like their birthday parties and play dates and the prom. And we do this all while using the science of applied behavior analysis. So that allows us to really take a look at the skills that we're learning, the instruction that we're providing, and whether or not it's effective in changing the behavior that we want to change. So less on that and more on our topic of communication. When we think about communication, there are so many different things that go into how we communicate with others. There's verbal communication, there's communication via the internet, via email, via text. So many ways that we can communicate with each other. And when we're thinking about communication with our providers, with our teams, I think a really good starting point, if we're looking to improve that communication, is to identify what does our ideal communication flow look like. So if we wanted to improve certain areas with our providers, communication with our providers and our teams, what would those be? And that really leads us to identify and answer a series of what questions. So the first one being, what is working really well in your communication with your providers or with your team? What is working and that is helping to yield effective outcomes for your child? It's really important to be able to identify what those things are, because those are the things that we want to keep and we don't want to change. And then in the same breath, also reflecting on what isn't working. So what do we want to change about the current communication that's happening between you and your teacher, you and your PPT team, you and an outside provider? What about that is not working? What is serving as a barrier? And then taking it a step further and looking at, okay, so now I know what is working and what I want to change. What does the ideal communication look like, right? So is that, how often is it happening? Am I communicating with my team once a week? Am I putting in place some sort of daily communication log? Am I looking at the response to concerns, questions, and emails that I'm sending out? Am I looking at that response time? So do I want to shift that away from taking 5 to 7 days for someone to respond to me to 2 days? And then again, what does it sound like? So what types of language are we using to communicate with each other, all while being realistic when setting the goal? So, I use the example of changing the response time to which you get an answer to a question or a concern. Hopefully it's not taking any provider or team 5 to 7 days to respond to or acknowledge your request. But let's say we're there. What we want to do is shift that to take less time for team members to respond to you. We also have to be realistic when setting that goal, right? So what is a realistic time frame, right? If we're changing and saying, okay, well, I want someone to respond to me within an hour, that's not really realistic, right? Because in fact, it would likely be concerning because those providers should be working with our kids or someone else's kids. But if we're talking about a time frame of 24 to 48 hours, that would certainly be more realistic. So as you're looking at what you want your ideal communication to look like and sound like, what you want to change, make sure that when you are doing the goal setting, that it is something that can be achieved. And then take it a step further. So once we've identified those components, let's look at what barriers are standing in the way of you getting, or of you improving communication. Or the communication that you want to see more of. So is it, a damaged rapport with your provider or team? How can we improve upon that? So once we can identify on what those barriers are, where that breakdown in communication is happening, then we can think of strategies that would help us to change the course or the direction that communication and that communicative relationship is occurring, right? So then you can begin to take action and identify strategies that can help you break down those barriers. So I think, goal setting for all intensive purposes is very, very important when it comes to improving communication. So now that we've talked about the goal setting aspect of this, let's talk about the preparation. So what are the things that we can do proactively and regularly to improve those communicative relationships with our providers and our teams? And when I structured this webinar and this talk, I did that within the context of, how can we utilize these strategies when talking to teams, or perhaps even when we're going into conferences. But the skills and strategies that are talked about here will be helpful in any situation, whether you're looking to improve a one-to-one provider interaction or a larger communicative relationship with an entire team. So there are a series of things that we can do proactively and regularly to kind of build that framework and foundation for improving communication over time. Okay. So the first one, if you're going into parent-teacher conferences, or if you're going into PPT meetings, any meeting discussing your child, it's important to be prepared. So, request and review the reports or whatever it is that you are going over ahead of time. It allows you to be a more informed decision maker, but it also reduces anxiety in the meeting. So when we're going into, and we're going to use PPT specifically, there's a lot of jargon that is used throughout the meetings. Every provider has, and background has its own set of language and vocabulary that's used. So on top of the fact that you're going into this meeting and you are there to try and decipher all of the reports and information that's being presented to you, and then the goals and services and accommodations that are being proposed, it's really, you have to pay attention to all those things, and you have to pay attention to the jargon because not everyone speaks in lay terms, right? That's really stressful. And then at the end of this meeting, you have to come to some sort of decision, right? So the more prepared you are, the more you're able to be an active participant, an active listener. You can ask the right questions. It helps you focus on your child and the results. So whether that's in a PPT or a parent-teacher conference, or even a one-to-one interaction, you want to be informed in order to be collaborative, be helpful, and to understand what's happening. What are the types of decisions that are being proposed in response or for your child's education, right? So be prepared, request and review the reports ahead of time, jot down questions, comments, concerns that you have, and if possible, try and get as many of them resolved ahead of time, but if not, have them ready with you in case you need them, so that you're not trying to process all of these things, right? You're not trying to process and understand all the language that's being thrown at you, all the goals that are being thrown at you, all the changes in services that are being thrown at you, all while trying to come up with questions to ask and concerns to raise. It's nearly impossible. So the more prepared you are, the easier the process is going to be, the more articulate you will be in raising the concerns that you want to raise, and the more collaborative you can be with your team. Okay. The other thing that is really important to do proactively is to pair yourself with reinforcement. So this doesn't have to be anything huge. I've seen parents, bring things like, donuts to meetings. That's very sweet, but it's not necessary, right? What we're talking about is building a relationship with our providers. And likewise, providers should be striving to build a relationship with you as well, right? Because we're all in it for the child's outcome. So it should be child focused. But that's not always the case, right? So if you're finding yourself in a situation where you have poor communication with your provider or your team for whatever reason, right? It's going to be very difficult for you to change those people's behaviors, right? That person's behavior, that group of people's behavior. But one thing that you can do is change your own behavior. And in response to you changing your behavior, people will adjust how they respond to you, right? So we could talk about and debate, well, everybody should be doing this, sure. But if you're not getting it, here are some things that you can do to try and change that course, right? So pair yourself with reinforcement, small warm gestures, build rapport and increase and approachability, right? So just regularly saying hi or giving a compliment or engaging in some small talk, a show of acknowledgement or gratitude or an empathetic statement. It's something that we all crave. It allows us to create a deeper connection where people are more comfortable than having more difficult conversations when it comes to that. So, and how to gauge if you have that or not. So do you have a good relationship when you're going into a classroom? Are people smiling at you, or are they avoiding your eye contact? Same case with on the flip side, right? So if you're going to see your provider, are you dreading it? Because we should not be dreading going with bring our child somewhere to services and avoiding our provider, right? There's something really wrong there if that's where we're at. And if that's where we're at, chances are the communication between you and the provider and the team isn't that great. If we're avoiding each other just by saying hi, then we're not communicating very effectively, and we're definitely not collaborating effectively or efficiently. So pairing yourself and making that human connection is really, really important. Another thing that's very helpful when you're going into meetings or even preparing to speak on behalf of your child with a provider is to have some sort of visual cue to stay on track. So this could be a notebook or an agenda with room for notes. And similarly, that in the same way that you request evals and proposed goals or report cards or what have you in preparation to review in preparation for the meeting, you can also request an agenda, because all of these meetings do have an agenda. So what this will allow you to do is, as you're reviewing all of these evals and whatever is on the agenda to be discussed, you can strategically write in where to put your questions, comments, and concerns related to each topic on that agenda, right? So you may, hopefully you may not even have to ask them, right? Because the team will get right to them. But then at least you can check off that, hey, that was a question that I had, or that was a concern that I had, but the team identified a course of action that they're going to take to remedy that. So really helpful to have a visual cue to stay on track, but also, so not only to help you throughout the meeting, but if something in the meeting goes south, right? If that communication, or if we hit a topic that makes everyone very defensive, right? And the communication breaks down, you have a point, a cue that will help you to then bring that conversation back to where it needs to be, right? But if we don't have that visual to stay on track, it's very easy to get sucked in, and then the hour passes, 2 hours pass, and you're not in a much different position than where you were when you went into it. And then arrange the setting events for success. So this might seem silly, and it's something that we often acknowledge but rarely do. So take care of you. Do your best to get enough rest before the meeting. Not always possible if we've got multiple kids running around, but there are still things that we can do to make sure that that getting ready in the morning or is easier, right? So lay everything out you need for the meeting, so that you have to grab and go. Because even if you have the best routines set in place in your home, if you've got a child or multiple kids, some things still go wrong in the morning, right? So the cereal that your child wanted is stale, or it's spilled all over the floor, and then they don't want another breakfast, right? There are things that will go wrong. And the last thing you need when you're preparing for a meeting that is occurring once every quarter or once a year or once every 3 years is to be all frazzled going into it, not having all of the information to make those informed decisions, to share, to really share how you feel and what you feel would be the best for your child, and to be an articulate member of the communication. So ensure, and then also ensure you're not going in on an empty stomach, right? The emotions in meetings, whether you're going to parent-teacher conferences, whether your child is struggling with behaviors and you're getting called in frequently to the principal's office, right? Emotions tend to run high in these types of meetings because, and rightfully so, right? It's your child at stake. We're talking about life-changing decisions in many situations. If you're focusing on the fact that you're hungry, you're less able to focus on what you want to communicate, but also less able to listen and really hear and understand what other people are saying, right? So eliminate those environmental contributors that can really make it more difficult to be the best communicator that you can be. Okay, so we talked about goal setting, we talked about things to do proactively and in preparation for the meeting. When we are actually meeting with our provider or providers or teams, how can we keep that flow of communication open? So I apologize for my camera. I'm not sure what's going on. It keeps Keeps going up on me. Okay. So the first one and most important one, I think, is to identify coping strategies. And we touched on this a few minutes back when I talked about emotions running high when we go into these types of meetings. That's true for you as a parent, but it's also true for providers. Everybody goes into these meetings with the intention, hopefully with the intention of doing the best thing that they can for a child, right? And there are lots of different perspectives, and there's, again, lots of different technical language. And then there are things that are going to pop up that will serve as triggers, and those may be different things for people, right? So it could be not getting an evaluation ahead of time to be able to review it for a meeting. That can set you into a bad mood, right? People sharing conflicting information about your child. So not being able to agree on where your child actually is, right? Not having data. All of these types of things could be triggers, and they could then cause a reaction inside of us, right? But when we're thinking about communicating most effectively, when we're going into these meetings that happen so infrequently, right? We want to make sure that we keep the flow of communication open with our provider and providers, and that we don't allow that to take over to the point where communication shuts down, right? Because that's not in the best service of your child. It's not in the best service of the outcome that you want to achieve. That's not to say that if something does happen, like, we said we would collect data and no data was collected, that still needs to be addressed at some point in that meeting or in a follow-up meeting, right? And there needs to be a plan of action to remedy it. But we have to be mindful of how we respond, because how we respond to situations then causes a chain reaction of responses in other people. And that will either continue to keep the flow of communication and collaboration open, or it will shut it down. And you can very easily see that, right? When with people's body language, are they avoiding eye contact? Did they go from being super active to really, really passive and just, okay, let's get through this. Let's just get this meeting over with and move on to the next thing, right? So it's important to be aware of what are your triggers, right? In the same way, when we talked about in the beginning, when we're thinking of improving communication, first of all, start with, what does that even look like? What's going well? What's not going well, right? Think about the triggers. So these are things that you definitely want to talk about at some point. You definitely want to remedy at some point, but think about how your behavior changes in response to them. Do you get really, really angry? And then do you get really, really accusatory or defensive? That's not to say that those emotions aren't validated, right? But the bigger question that you need to ask is, how does that further impact the conversations around communication and collaboration with your team? And does that, in that meeting that happens once a quarter or once a year or once every 3 years, is that going to be helpful in that moment to work towards achieving your goal? Right? And if we're seeing that communication is shutting down, it's not helpful, right? And then you're likely not going to be in a position where you're able to really make effective and efficient gains for your child. So, what are some things you can do to stay cool, calm, and collected when these things get challenging, right? Do you need to go and use the bathroom and excuse yourself for a minute, or get a drink of water, right? And then come back, take a few deep breaths, and then write down what that thing that triggered you is, because that's something that has to get addressed, but not in that moment, right? Not in an emotional response, because that's going to impact how the rest of that meeting goes. And that's sad, but it's human nature, right? We all respond to things. We all have triggers and we all have responses, and those responses in turn affect how other people behave. So if you can get that figured out, that will be really, really helpful in improving communication with your team. Okay, so then we also want to reinforce the behaviors we want to see more of, right? So highlight, praise, and demonstrate gratitude for the behaviors that are really be for your child and helping move that communication forward. Because most people, majority of people, enjoy receiving compliments, enjoy being acknowledged, right? So if they do something that then is tied to a praise or an acknowledgement statement, that behavior is more likely to occur again in the future. You can also use shaping to shape behavior of closer and closer approximations to your goals. So in the beginning, we used the example of, let's say you want to decrease the amount of time it takes for a provider or a team to respond to your questions or concerns. And let's say right now, your baseline is it takes 5 to 7 days, which is a really long time and is a huge, huge problem. So if that's the case, we need to work on that, right? So how can we use shaping in addition to other things to help move closer and closer approximations? So if you do have that provider who responds to you faster in a faster time span than they usually do, make a big deal about that. Hey, thank you so much. I appreciate the fact that you got back to me so quickly. I know that you're, in this with us for a child, and I appreciate the flow of communication. Whatever it is that you need to do, you can shape that behavior, right? To then, okay, well, I feel I feel like I'm contributing. I feel like what I'm doing, people are acknowledging the steps that I'm taking for that child. So I'm going to make sure that I'm going to respond to this parent faster next time, right? And again, be realistic with those expectations. So we don't want to set goals of responding within the hour or within 45 minutes, because that nowhere in the world is that going to happen. And then if it does, then there's a whole other problem, right? Because if you've got teachers that are supposed to be with kids and they're responding to emails all day, then who's teaching the kids, right? Okay, use team-based language. So use unifying language during meetings, we instead of I, because what I found that using I language or the speech pathologist or the behavior therapist thinks is really divisive and puts people on the defensive. It doesn't allow. When you're working on a multidisciplinary team, the idea is you have people from different areas and they're supposed to bring in their expertise together, and they're supposed to find some sort of compromise in how they can utilize all these expertise to help your child. If everybody is referring to themselves as their own entity, as their own expertise, you're not really working as a team. All you're doing is throwing a bunch of different solutions, but they're not really working together. In the same way, when we think about crossover between home and school, families oftentimes want to know, what types of things are being reinforced in school, because those are the types of things we want to reinforce at home. And then similarly, what types of things are being reinforced at home that are important to the family that we can reinforce in school, right? So we want to use unifying language so that we get away from each provider being its own entity, but rather a cohesive team that takes all of their expertise and really creates something amazing as a result of it. Okay, so during the meeting, it's also really important to stay objective and focused, okay? So keep the language always should be child-centered. We should always be sticking to the facts, so less opinions. There's a time and place for opinions, but opinions can also be very dangerous, because opinions can also be responses to how we are feeling on a particular day about a series of things that have happened, and that can impact, right, how we convey information. So sticking to the facts is very important. And when you're raising your concerns, identify the why. Why is that important? In as much as providers have the expertise of sharing information about milestones and different educational benchmarks that children need to meet, there is also real world things that are important to consider when making those types of decisions. So, how does that really translate to skills in real life, right? So it's like when you're sharing your concerns, identify the why and be one to offer a solution. That's not to say that the solution that you offer is necessarily going to be the one that the team goes with, but show that you're not only willing to, or not only able to bring up barriers, but also given thought to, hey, how can we work together on solving these? How can we work together on overcoming these? Because that will then open up further conversations with team members on ways to overcome the obstacle or barrier, and then refocus if needed. And this is where we're having kind of an agenda or some sort of visual cue available to you is really important, because when you are going into these meetings, they do get emotional. I have yet to be in one that has not gotten emotional for a variety of different reasons. And people do need refocusing. And if people on your team aren't able to refocus, then you can be the one that can refocus. And again, in as much as, you know, we are doing all of these things proactively, let's say you're the first one on your team who's making these steps to improve to improve your communication with your provider or providers, you're also modeling and setting the foundation and the boundaries for what you want this to look like on a larger scale, right? You're coming in and being the one that's organized. You're coming in and you've got your questions figured out, right? That's really being a model for what you expect future meetings with that provider to look like. And, you know, if that provider is, you know, really there for your child and really there to improve their own practice, then they'll look at what a good model looks like, and they will try to emulate some of that. So that's really important. Now, as much as we look at the do's, here are some things to avoid. So avoid placing blame, using absolutes, and making assumptions. So these can be really tempting to do when things get emotional, when there are things that happen that trigger feelings. But I guarantee you all of these things will take the focus away from your child, will take the focus away from solution seeking, and will put everyone on the defensive, and it will shut down communication or put it on the path for it to being shut down. And that's not helpful, right? If that's not what you're going for, if that's not serving your ultimate goal, go back to, you know, what kinds of strategies that you can have in place for yourself to make sure that some of these things aren't happening. And that can be really difficult to do, especially if someone on the team starts this type of jargon, right? How do we refocus that to get back to be child-centered? Because we should always be child-centered. We should always be sticking to the facts, to the information, and working collaboratively to find solutions. Okay, and then take notes. So again, this is where having that visual cue is super, super helpful, because you can then jot down, okay, things that the team agreed on, answers that you got to your questions, new questions that came up as a result of it, because there will always be new questions that come up as a result of many of these meetings or conferences, because there's just such a limited amount of time to go over so much information. And then concerns or any outstanding items if you run out of time. So this will help you identify what are the next things that I need to do. What direction do we need to move forward in next? Okay, so we talked about what to do to proactively get ready for communication, what to do during communication, and what not to do. Now, is that where our communication ends? It's not, right? So I would venture to say that following up post a meeting, taking time to reflect, and ensuring everyone is on the same page is just as critical of a step as being in the meeting itself. Because oftentimes, and as much as we all come to the table as different providers with different perspectives, right? And essentially, different agendas and how we want to address a given situation, people also interpret information differently, right? So you could have a thing you agreed on, right? A thing that was communicated in that meeting, and someone thought of it slightly differently, and then the way that translates out looks completely different, right? So that follow-up is really, really important step of effective communication. So as you're doing that, post a meeting, reflect on your effectiveness. Sorry about the typo there. So what went well? What about that meeting went really well? Did it help to be prepared? Did you get to ask all of your questions? Did the team answer most of your questions before you even got to ask them? And then at the same time, what do you wish you had said or did differently? What did you maybe react to that you noticed shut down communication for a little bit, but then you were maybe able to get it back out of it? And then what's still outstanding, right? So if you've had any of those triggers come up that you were successfully able to navigate in the meeting, those don't end there, right? If they were triggers, if they're patterns of behavior that are occurring frequently, then that's something that still needs to get addressed. Write that down as something that's still outstanding that you need to work through and communicate through and collaborate through. Okay, so follow up in writing, right? So again, we all come away with different perspectives or different thoughts based on what we feel is the best thing, right? So send an email to the team. Thank them for the meeting, praise them for the things that went well. These are things that are going to help with that rapport building, right? And continue that rapport building for the future. And then summarize, what was discussed, what was agreed to at the meeting. And you can do this very simply, right? Bullet pointed lists, stick to the facts of how you remember them, because this really allows you and the team to take some time to clarify misunderstandings, which there will likely be some, right? So following up in writing allows everyone to read back all of the information or the important points of the information that they were deliberating on in a meeting and say, well, I don't remember that way, or I don't remember that we were going to do this, or hey, we forgot this, right? So it's a great way for everyone to come back to the same page and to agree in writing what that same page was, right? And to further answer any questions or additional concerns that arise as a result of it. Okay, and then identify next steps. So once you've really sat down, you've reflected on what went well, what's still outstanding, what didn't go so well that you want to change for the next time. Identify what those next steps are, right? So did everything get resolved after you sent a follow-up thank you email, just reiterating kind of, what you talked about? Are you still on the same page, or did you get a response? Well, we never discussed that, or whatever the situation is, right? So is everyone on the same page? Do you have any outstanding concerns or questions still? And are those things that can get resolved with, a simple phone call or conversations? Or do you need a whole nother meeting because, you got far, but you didn't get to where you needed to be, and that conversation needs to continue to happen? Or ultimately, and sometimes this happens, have you done your best? Have you done your best to put in place and to change and to improve communication, but you're still not getting very far with your provider or with your team? Do you need additional supports to come to a resolution? And what does that look like, right? So the post process is just as important as the preparation and the time in the actual communication. And then it's important to stay persistent and consistent, right? So lasting behavior change takes time. If you are deciding to be the catalyst for change and trying to improve that communication and being the first one to take those steps, it's not going to happen in that first interaction, right? So you have to be committed to continuing that series of behaviors in order to really see a result. Don't give up. Follow the process until you get the resolution that your child needs to succeed. And if you need extra supports in order for that to happen, then you need extra supports in order for that to happen. But also celebrate the successes, your own and that of your team, any obstacles that you've overcome. If you have the opportunity to overcome adversity or conflict with anyone or with your team, that essentially will bring you closer together, right? That will improve that relationship. That will show your commitment to, not only the advocacy that you bring for your child, but also the commitment to working together and being a good communicator, but also an integral part of the collaborative process. And then develop a plan of action to overcome those barriers. So if you have any outstanding items, what's the next step? It doesn't stop after that meeting. It doesn't stop after that communication. It's a process that continues to cycle through, and then you have to reassess at every step, what is improved, what is still something that we need to work on, or has nothing improved. Those are all important questions that need to be asked continually in order for that lasting change to take place over time. All right, so takeaways in improving communication and review. So set those goals, prepare ahead of time, keep the flow of communication open. You can do that by reading body language and people's facial expressions and tone. Reflect on how things went. Follow up. It would be a shame to do all of that work and then not take that step to follow up and have it all fall apart at that last step. Determine next steps and then repeat. So keep it going, keep going at it. Don't give up. As an advocate for your child, it's not in the cards for any parent, nor is it anything that any parent would consider. So keep at it, and hopefully over time things will improve. All right, so let me see. I think we're at the end, so we can certainly open it up to questions. I'm not sure if anyone popped in while we were recording.
That was great.
We have a couple, thank you. We have a couple people hanging on. So if anybody who's on want to put in the Q&A button, any questions for Justyna?
Not seeing anything on my end on the Q&A, but I'm
no,
not
sure. I don't see anything either right now.
But I'm able to get the Q&A to pop up for the first time.
Oh, nice. I know, it's like the constant change even here in the virtual world.
Yeah, so if any of you would prefer to type questions later and send them to us, you can send them to us at info@spednetwilton.org, and we can forward those on to Justyna, just for anyone sitting here now watching, or for anyone who's going to watch later. You can do that. But if you're typing right now, Justyna, this was so great. And I hope that every parent can watch this before they go into a PPT, whether it's their first PPT or their 20th. I mean, honestly, everything in here is such great advice. And really the best PPTs I think we've seen have been the ones where it is a true partnership between the parent and the team. And that doesn't mean that the conversations are always going to be positive or that there's not going to be disagreement. But that at the end of the day, everyone remembers that it's really about the child and not about the individual sitting at the table. So this has been incredibly helpful.
Good. I'm glad. Yeah, it's really sad to see and be a part of meetings that break down where the focus of that meeting goes away from the child. It's really disheartening because they do happen so infrequently. You have 1 year meeting a year or every 3 years, and in that time frame, you have to decide everything that will help your child for the next 3 years or for the next year. So it's really important to keep that open.
There is one question. I don't know, can you see it or do you want me to read it?
me, where is the line between when I think I have this working well and when I have to call in a professional to join me? It's a really good question. So I think if you're utilizing, these skills, if you're making attempts to be an effective communicator and you're building rapport, you shouldn't see too much bounce between meetings. So you shouldn't be going into a meeting that's going really, really well, and then you go into the next meeting and it's tanking, and you're going to a meeting that's going really well and you're going to a meeting that's tanking. You should kind of see a consistent effort of communication improving on all sides. If you're going into meetings and it's sporadic, some of the time you're getting it, some of the time you're not, and you've been at it for a while, then it might be time to have a professional join you. I think though, how that's done also speaks volumes to whether the team will be open and receptive and keep those lines of communication open versus whether we're presenting it as a punishment, right? So I think the way we phrase, if we do, because many times we do get to a point where you just need a moderator sometimes, right? Where it's just the relationships or whatever has just had this history, this negative history, and you need someone neutral to come in. How that's presented to the team will also be a big indicator of whether or not that's going to be something positive for the team as a whole, or something that will continue to bring about more barriers, right? So, how we phrase it is really important. I think you could say something along the lines of, we've been really trying, everybody's been trying really, really hard to make this work. I think it would be a great idea to have someone that's impartial, someone that can give us, another perspective on this to help to open up those lines of communication versus, this isn't working. No one is here for my child. I'm going to, lawyer up or get an advocate. Those two ways of presenting it and how it's received is going to make a big difference. That's not to say that, right, you'll get the advocate or lawyer and they're not going to make gains regardless of whether or not your team is receptive or not. But it's definitely a lot more pleasant all around, right? If we're continuing to communicate effectively and work toward that collaborative process than if we're really trying to have to make people push through certain things. I hope that answers the question.
Need that elevator music again.
Yeah. I have to figure out what's going on with my camera. I apologize.
I know. Is it in your computer or is it a separate camera?
No, so it's on top of my monitor.
Oh.
And so it gives me the ability to kind of adjust it down, but then for some reason it rises back up. Just something that I have to figure out for the next time.
Oh.
That was
All
great,
right.
Justyna.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me back. It's always so much fun hanging out with you ladies.
In case people are still typing, we'll give them another minute, but a couple of the things you pointed out are so important. Don't forget that you can ask questions. It's never wrong to ask questions, and you should ask as many questions as you need to feel like you've been informed. And then also coming in with solutions. If you have concerns, you can come in and bring your concerns, but also try to bring in some solutions that maybe you can discuss with the team. That's always a good tip.
Yeah.
And then don't be afraid to take a break, right?
Right.
I need to take a break. This is hard for me to hear. Can we take a break? I think the team appreciates that it's really hard for the parent, especially if there's 7 or 8 people sitting across the table, and it can be stressful.
Yeah. And intimidating.
Yeah.
You're walking in. I think like that whole process in and of itself with how parents are greeted should also be changed and adjusted. Everybody's sitting, everybody's ready, and here you come, to this group of 10, 13 people.
Yeah.
It's really intimidating. So, but there's There is no dumb question. I think, you know, if you don't ask the question, that, you know, that it's tough, because at the end of the day, it's impossible to verse yourself in all of the language that's being utilized, all of the decisions that are being made, whether, you know, even if you're in this field, sometimes you're not quite sure what's being said or what's being discussed. So there's no dumb questions ever.
I think it's nice to know that the parents should also not maybe always feel like they need to bring a lawyer, an advocate, but bring a friend. Sometimes it's just having that sort of moral support, or just knowing that you have somebody else with you, and then somebody who can take notes. I know Janine's been a couple of my transition PPTs, just to take notes, because we had 14 people around the table. It gets overwhelming, and trying to listen, and either how prepared you are, it's hard for one person. So even if you don't feel like you need an advocate or a lawyer, you know, but don't want to go in by yourself, you know, I'm sure find a friend.
And to lend also a different perspective, you know, when you have someone who doesn't have that history with your team or providers, or it's helpful to say, hey, you know, what did this look like or sound like to you from someone who's never attended it, right? It can be helpful. Sometimes we get so stuck in trying to solve a problem within the box.
Yeah.
We can't take a step back out and see the bigger picture.
Yeah.
We're going to post.
We don't see anything here. I don't see anything more in the Q&A. So for time purposes, did you want to say something?
I just wanted to say we're going to post some parent-teacher conference worksheets on our website to go along with this, areas to discuss, just to sort of have the parent before you go in, focus to see, you know, what the kid is struggling with, understands assignments, finishes on time, turns in completed work, just sort of a list from understood .org, which is a terrific website, and that'll be all on our website.
And also, Eve, another thing to remember is your handbook too. The handbook from
our
is
handbook.
a great tool for before you go into PPTs, just to read through, to get some of the jargon fresh in your mind, right?
Oh, goodness. Right.
I know. I'm going to promote ourselves here.
For those of you who might not know, SpedNet has, you know, a guide to special services bringing knowledge to the table, which I think, you know, which I've heard from so many people, I mean, which we wrote for ourselves, but is so important to read before you go in. It's a short read. It's only 40-something pages. You know, online, it will give you live links, so it can take you, you know, forever, just depending on how much stuff you want to research before you go in. But just as a way of understanding the process, it's a wonderful tool.
It's a great handbook. It's the first book I read.
Great. I've read it many times, and
Yeah.
I'll have to read it again.
And free online on our website.
Yeah. And it's always in our email blast on the bottom. It's always a link there. So.
Awesome. It's amazing
All
to
right.
have access to so many resources. I think that's been the one great thing about so many people going virtual, is all of these resources, free resources that have popped up and been created for families. It's just now a time thing, right? Can we get enough time to filter through them?
I know. I just saw an article about Zoom fatigue. I'm sure that's real too. All right. So in light of time and for everybody's time this morning, I will log off and
thank you, Justyna.
we'll see you. Thank you, Justyna.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.